Um, so yes, my name's Mike. I'm a founder and CEO at a company called Merkely. We changed our name yesterday, which up until yesterday the company was called Compliance DB. So for those of you that are technologists, you'll understand that some refactorings are easier than others. So changing the name of a company was a bit more involved than I expected, but we're through the other side. My background is in technology. I studied computer science, and I worked 10 years as a systems programmer in the oil and gas industry. So making very kind of low level systems, but part of very large industrial systems like directional drilling tools, guidance systems, seismic acquisition, borehole acquisition, these kind of tools. So I was working in the kernel, device drivers, networks, and root file systems, and so on. So I spent 10 years kind of in that world, but I was always very interested in process and how we made software. So I got to be introducing test-driven development, continuous integration, continuous delivery into teams, and I ended up kind of falling into this world of DevOps over time. And then 6 years ago, I left that world to start a DevOps consulting firm here in Scandinavia with a couple of Danish partners, and we built a DevOps consulting firm over the years. And it was through that time that I got to see really kind of some of the very interesting challenges that happen in trying to apply DevOps in regulated industries. So I would work with, for example, automotive companies that were they were needed to meet ISO 26262. Medical devices, and also in finance. And what I'm going to talk about today is really about some of those interesting cases, and particularly the finance industry, and what DevOps, change management, and the regulations, how it all fits together there. Yeah, and I guess we just get started. So I guess going back, there's been a big change in the world of finance over the last 5 years, and really the key thing is that the physical presence of banks isn't important anymore. And I mean, 2019, 2020, COVID, all of these things have just accelerated this change. Most of the companies that I talk to that are in the financial sector have some story along the lines of, we're not a bank, we're a technology company with a banking license. Or they've got some story around digital transformation. And the reason is that their branches are no longer important. The customer service staff in branches meeting customers physically are not where they win and lose in the market now. It's to do with their internet bank, their mobile bank, their payment services, and their technical capabilities and their ability to innovate. And Capital One has always been one of these kind of leaders in the digital space in terms of banking. And Rich Fairbank says this, that ultimately the winners in banking will have the capabilities of a world-class software company. What that means in practice is that they have to stop thinking as if they're banks with an IT department. They have to think more like they're Apple or Google or Amazon, where technology is the core driving force of their technical capabilities. It's quite an interesting change. Now, as well as the kind of the world around the banks changing, software itself is changing. We've gone from very monolithic IT systems that are typically run in a data center by their IT departments on very big servers. They're very monolithic architectures, and they're very slow changing. And there's a lot of process around how these things change. The idea is that change is something to be avoided and managed very carefully. But over time, architectures have evolved, technologies have evolved. We've gone to service-oriented architectures, containers, cloud, very, very dynamic infrastructure, very, very loosely coupled systems. And the rate of changes has gone through the roof. Most of the companies we talk to the rate of change has gone through 3 exponential changes in the last 5 years, and they don't see that stopping. In fact, this is something they only want to accelerate. So change is becoming like really the core theme of how they deliver technology. The challenge that they face is that change management hasn't really changed in these environments for a long time. They're still using the ITIL standards from the 1980s, essentially, where you have change windows, you schedule a change in a calendar for a system on a specific date. You have change advisory board meetings where typically with the change advisory board meetings I've sat in, they have a lot of people from different parts of the organization coming in to explain what their change is to an IT change management board, who nobody in the room knows anybody else's systems. So it doesn't really add an awful lot of value. And then there's a lot of manual documentation, creating SharePoint sites, creating wiki pages, creating release documentation, test reports, and so on. And all of this leads to a lot of batching. And the reason why that they're doing this is more or less because this is how they've done it in the past, and this is how they changed their mainframe system. So they're kind of bringing on these legacy processes into the modern times. The sad thing is that these methods are proven to be ineffective at mitigating risk. Now, Nicole Forsgren and our team at DORA have done a lot of research into this. They release the state of DevOps reports every year for the last 5 years, it's like 6 years now, where they look and they do research and surveys into how software actually changes in industry, and figuring out what works and what doesn't, what's predictive of performance and what is predictive of poor performance. And what they found is that external approvals like the Change Advisory Board were negatively correlated with lead time. Also with deployment frequency and restore time, which makes sense. Any kind of gate to change will hurt your ability to deliver. But what they also found is that they don't reduce the risk of changes. In fact, it was worse than having no change approval process at all. Having a change advisory board was predictive of poorer quality, which was quite an interesting finding. So you might say, well, if it doesn't work, why is it like this? Why do people even do this? Here's an example from Australia. The Australian regulator is called APRA, and they have their guidelines on how banks that they're regulating should make software changes. So they talk a lot about you must have controls to manage changes to your systems. You must have approval of changes prior to deployment. You must have a segregation of duties to prevent personnel from deploying their own software changes to production. So there's a lot of kind of requirements written down in these guidelines about how they met. The thing is that often teams haven't evaluated how they should implement these requirements, because the requirements are quite general. Now, a bit closer to home, I live here in Oslo in Norway, and we have Finanstilsynet, which is like our local regulating body for the financial services industry. And they have a law that they audit against as well. And typically the things they ask for in an audit is like, what is your software development process? Do you even have a way of making software defined? How do you follow that process? Are you conforming to that process? Can you prove it? How do you ensure that you follow it? And then they'll ask all kinds of questions like what software is in production, what changes were in the last release, what was deployed on a certain date, who was accepted and signed off on the risk of this change. And generally, it's a lot of fishing and going through all the different systems and making sure everything has been done how you actually say it's being done. So, okay, if you zoom out enough, and it's the same actually in like the medical standards, the automotive standards, the safety critical standards, and the financial standards. Anyway, what's happening is that you're being asked to define a process for how things change, how things get done in your organization and the technology scope. And then with that process, you have to actually follow that process, what we call the implementation. You actually have to do work the way that you say you do in the process. And then finally, the third kind of part of the puzzle is that you need the proof that you follow the process. So you need the audit trail, the traceability to show that you've always followed this process. Because when the auditors come in, they're going to say, show me your process, and then show me the proof that you follow that process. Now, in a traditional organization, taking ITIL standards for an example, the way that that is implemented in an organization is often the process definition, your software process, you're often called your software delivery lifecycle or so on, is defined in wiki documentation. Somewhere, somebody is taking responsibility to define, this is how we make software in our organization. Now, it's up to the individual teams in the bank to actually follow that process. In the old days, that would be with manual build, manual QA reports, and then deployments, changes, change advisory boards, and so on. And then the proof would actually be in meeting minutes and change documentation that would have to be produced for everything going out. Now, in the world of DevOps, we can go and solve a lot of these same problems, the need for process, the need for implementation, and the need for proof, with an awful lot of automation. The old ways don't follow through. So for instance, if we start in the middle, the implementation, and say our DevOps pipeline is how we make change. This is how we enforce our pull requests, our version control strategy, our branching strategy, how we do QA, how we do testing, how we do deployment, how we do sign-offs. Everything can be wrapped up in your automation. And from that, you can produce the live documentation that shows how your software is created. So in other words, deriving your documentation from the actual running automation. And then on the other side, you've got the proof. And that's another thing that automation can help with. To generate the audit trail, you can do that in a large part automatically. Now, what I see a lot in banks these days is that they've already adopted DevOps. They're using pipelines, they've got CI automation, and maybe even doing some kind of automated processes around how things change. But this audit trail and the deployment stage ends up being the bottleneck. So they never like automate this proof step. And what that looks like is this. It's what we call DevOps lite, where you still have change management, but you have it as a gate. So the teams themselves are using kind of DevOps tools. So they've got CI, test automation, security analysis, static analysis, all of this stuff. And they can build and qualify in really fast loops. The thing is, though, they can't get to production because they still have these old ways of working. They've got these high ceremony change management compliance where they still go to the change advisory board. They still create the SharePoint site to fill in the forms to show that this release is what's going out. So what that does is it really increases your deployment lead times. And of course, the longer the lead times, the higher the release risks. Every additional change you bring into a batch increases the risk and makes it harder to recover from failure. In the world of continuous change management, what we argue for is that change management compliance can be built into every single change you do. You can gather the audit trail automatically. You can bake your controls automatically in, and that can lead to lower lead times, shorter lead times, and lower release risks, of course. Now, there's another angle that is really important in the financial world as well, and it's this concept of insider threat. So the regulators, of course, they're looking at change management and so on and security, but this insider threat is a very special case for some organizations where the idea is that your system should be robust even if there's an employee inside your organization with access to your services from doing unauthorized things. So as a kind of very silly example, imagine an employee in a bank who puts into production a change that nobody sees that starts taking pennies off of transactions, start making money in an unauthorized way. So at Google, they talk a lot about this too, because I mean, going back to Christian's talk before me, it also gets into the GDPR concepts as well, where you want to make sure that even people inside your organization can, for example, get to personal data that they're not authorized for. And so you have this idea of you need to be robust against the insider threat. You also need to have this change management story around the processes and auditability of how systems change. Now, this is an awful big problem to solve for. And from my previous life in consulting, one of the most important tools that I ever brought to any of the customers wasn't a CI tool. It wasn't a new testing methodology. It wasn't a new even reorganization. It was this concept from Lean, and it's the value stream map. And like before you think about tools and techniques and automation and all this rest, what you really should start with is understanding what your value stream is as it is today. And that means in a typical software organization, going from the requirement of coming from either the market or the product management or marketing, there's some need that needs to be met, all the way for it to be delivered to the customer and for them to get value from that change. So it could be a new feature in the mobile bank, it could be a new feature in internet bank, it could be a new loan application process, whatever it happens to be. From having the requirement all the way to production, what does that value stream map? And that's really, in a technology organization, this is how change is delivered. And that's really important. So it could be lots of things. It could be how you do requirements, how you do test, how you do version control, how you do programming, how you do pair programming, what tools and techniques you use actually in the teams at the in the technology, how you deploy the software, how you validate the software, how you monitor the software. Figuring out that big picture usually involves an awful lot of teams. So once you've figured out what that value stream is, then you can start to optimize. You can figure out, okay, what is it we actually need from a change management perspective and from a security perspective? What controls do we need to put into our systems? What audit trail, what proof do we need from this value stream to show the world that we are doing as we say we're doing? And then from that knowledge, you can turn that into a real DevOps change management guide. So now you have this this goal, what the vision is for your change management. There's kind of three keys that I think are really important to this process. One is binary provenance, two is control automations, and three is human in the loop controls. I'm just going to go through each of these really quickly so you get an idea of some of the concepts you can bring to your pipelines essentially. So the first one, and this is really important from many, many different ways, but mostly it comes down to security. It's binary provenance. It's whatever it is that you're doing in your change management systems, you need to be able to uniquely identify your software. So the idea is if you go from, imagine you're having an audit and you want to know what software is in production, how would you identify that software? I mean, there's lots of ways you could do it. You could do it with file names, you could do it with metadata, you could do it with some kind of semantic versioning scheme. They're kind of what we would call weak binary provenance mechanisms because these are all labels for your binaries. And what we prefer is what we call content addressable storage, where the idea is that you take your software package and run it through some kind of digest algorithm like SHA-256 to get a unique fingerprint for your packages. So as an example, if it happened to be a Docker image, you could use the repo digest. If it happened to be a jar file, you could just take the OpenSSL digest of the file and so on. But in the end, you want to be able to know that if a single byte in this package changes, you're going to get a different fingerprint. And that is key for two reasons. Once you can uniquely identify that software, you can trace that software to an audit trail. So you can find out who approved it for production, what tests that was done, what tests were performed against this, what source code revision it came from. If you have a unique way for identifying software and building an audit trail against that piece of software that's secure, then you have the foundations for a trust in your change management. Now, the second step is controls automation. So taking your value stream and figuring out what your controls have to be in order for you to be compliant with your process. Now, that could be a typical one is code review controls. Like nearly every financial organization will say all code must have gone through code review. Just that simple. They call it the 4 eyes control. And the idea behind that is you don't want people to be able to sneak code into production that nobody else has seen. It's like the first line of defense against the insider threat. So you could say that, okay, one way is to say that code review, all code must be code reviewed on your wiki page, and that's your software process, and just hope that people follow it. A more kind of DevOps approach to that is to actually build controls into your pipelines that check that. So in your pipeline, you get the code review data for this commit, and you check, has this been verified? Does this code review meet our standards? And if so, we're going to record that we've performed this control. If not, we're going to fail the pipeline, and this change doesn't make it into the product. And you can go through with more controls. It can be unit tests, functional tests, security analysis, any kind of audit trail and controls that you're going to build into your pipelines. Start to attach that evidence to this binary. Once you have that audit trail, you can also use that to make decisions in your pipeline as well. For instance, if you have a distributed pipeline, say you have a separate pipeline for deployment steps, you can get this audit trail data and make the decision, should I deploy this binary into production? Has it been approved? Do we have all the compliance data we expect to have? Do we even know this binary? Do we have this some kind of concept of binary provenance for this? And then finally, this human in the loop controls. So there's an awful lot DevOps can do for us in terms of automation, both in terms of the manual steps in the system, the documentation in the audit trail, and the controls. But there's some things that can't be replaced by people. Some aspects of the control system must involve somebody looking at the change, understanding the changes, and accepting the risk of these changes. And that typically is what we would call some kind of release approval. We want to build that into our pipelines. We want that release approval to be based on the binary, or at least the fingerprint of the binary that we're going to put into production, and having the evidence that we know of all the controls that have gone against this. If that makes sense. And then when we do our deployments, having a kind of a circuit breaker that we only deploy binaries to production that have been approved, that we have all this data about. And then we could take it one step further and do runtime monitoring. We could do, like Christian mentioned, with Open Policy Agent, applying a policy saying that only these Docker images are eligible to run in our cluster, as an example, doing real-time monitoring to know that everything that's running in production has been approved for production. But there's a very important role for people in this whole story. People are kind of still a key to the risk reduction aspects of this process. So that's kind of really what I wanted to talk about, this idea of compliance as code, trying to build change management at a way that scales with DevOps. The old ways just don't keep up with modern DevOps teams. When you're delivering thousands of changes a week, a change advisory board meeting doesn't mean anything. You need to automate your compliance controls, have provable audit trails, have live documentation that keeps sync with the way you're working, and kind of security at every step. Because in the end, DevOps has this concept of the empowered team, and the empowered team is a team that doesn't rely on another team to deliver their work. So for instance, a dev team relying on operations to deploy their software, or a QA department to sign off on this, or an IT change management board to approve a deployment. Empowered teams take all the control of their value stream and they deliver on it in a safe, secure way. And that's what we're really trying to get to with DevOps change management. So that was what I wanted to share today. I hope there might be some questions. Otherwise, feel free to get in touch with me on LinkedIn or social, or send me a mail. Love to talk some more.
Thank you, Mike. It has been really, I think, clear and interesting presentation, and it's taking me at least to kind of journey back there in time when we did ITIL and CAB meetings and all of that, and built a lot of European Union agriculture benefit systems. So okay. That was like transferring millions to somebody's account, hopefully the right account. But is anybody having any questions? If so, then do not hesitate to put them into the chat. And then we have also the panel discussion starting in about 5 minutes, so you'll get to hear more from Mike and the other speakers. But I have just this question that, how do you see this kind of built into the process, reviewing and auditing and checking? How do you see it, like, from newbie software development teams or already kind of established software development teams? Is it taught in schools, and what should be done? I mean, I've seen a lot of newbies like struggling with it. And
in terms of DevOps or?
In terms of DevOps and also building the kind of checks and the review process there, and maybe automated checks. Like, I remember I had a team where we had to actually introduce, like, automate, like, CI pipeline and do the kind of checks there automatically, that are we using the right kind of a secure code and libraries and all of that. So how do you see that kind of happening in the company right now?
I think it's still quite naive, but like I can say that the university has come a long way in the recent years. In my last company, we used to do free courses at the university during the summer. We'd do a 5-day course where we teach the students Git and Jenkins and Docker and test-driven development, and it was great, because this was not covered in curriculum in any of the universities. And of course, that was part of our recruiting strategy and so on also, but it was, even very basic things like version control wasn't really taught to a professional level. And I understand that there's a tension there, because in academia, they're really trying to teach timeless concepts, especially in like computer science departments. And that kind of, there's a friction there towards what industry needs. So I still think it's really up to companies to train their people and to build these learning organizations. You can't expect in this day and age that you're going to get very mature, ready to go developers coming out of the university. You need to spend time and grow these talents. And it's the same for your experienced people as well. I mean, technology is constantly evolving and it's moving faster and faster. You need to keep investing in your knowledge.
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right, because what I see is that there's a lot of emphasis on, like, bugs and testing, let's say. Like, is our software working as it should work? But then there's the kind of, is it working safely, and can we automate those checks before even coming to the real compliance checking and automation? So I absolutely think you're right. It is up to all of us to kind of make sure that our teams are knowing what they're doing and using the technology to their advantage.